Russia's economy is in deep trouble. Ukrainian drone strikes have been taking out some of Russia's largest oil refineries, and this is creating some bigger and bigger problems for Russia's energy sector. On February 4th, Russian drones targeted the Rosneft oil refinery in Ryazan, which is Russia's third largest oil refinery. They also targeted Russian fuel storage facilities in Krasnodar Krai. Prior to this, on January 14th, Ukraine struck the Saratov oil refinery and 11 other targets. And again on September 14th of 2024, Ukraine struck the Oriol oil terminal, which is one of the largest oil terminals in all of Russia. Just in 2024 alone, Russia took a drop by 9.1% in its seaborne oil exports, with its oil refining volumes dropping to some of their lowest levels in 12 years. Let's take a closer look at these drone attacks and see exactly how they are working. Where is Ukraine targeting? What kind of platforms are they using, and what tactics and strategies are they employing? And what is the cost to Russia beyond just 2024? How have these strikes paired with Western sanctions, and how does all this put Russia's economy into a bind heading into the future? Note that I've already covered Russia's wartime costs and how exactly their wartime losses are putting their economy into a bit of a spiral, with their losses leading to increased defense spending, which is skyrocketing inflation. Definitely check that video out, but I'll link you to that at the end of this video. Let's go and get started. Following Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Russia has been placed under a heavy sanctions regime by the West. 45 different countries have joined the sanctions regime targeting Russian banks, the defense sector, specific members of Russian leadership, as well as Russian trade. However, there is one more controversial area that sanctions have really not had a consistent impact on, and that of course is the energy sector. Russia is one of the largest energy exporters in the world, and Europe is of course heavily dependent on Russian energy, specifically LNG, or liquefied natural gas. In fact, fully knowing the security threats being posed by Russia, Germany in 2023 decided to shut down all of its nuclear reactors and instead double down on Russian imported energy, and this was of course almost a year after the full-scale invasion took off in Ukraine. Then of course October 7th happened, and there was a real risk of a larger regional war picking up in the Middle East, and that sent energy prices further skyward. That made many Western countries even more gun-shy about targeting Russia's energy sector, to include the United States. So while Russia has had challenges in procuring more complex things like computer chips and other kinds of more technical material, they've been able to sell their energy just fine. And overall, that has sustained Russia's economy at least up to this point. So Ukraine has decided to take these matters into their own hands. The only issue is that they've had to get creative. They, at the start of the war, didn't necessarily have the capability of targeting Russia's energy infrastructure. A lot of their infrastructure is a long ways from Ukraine. And it's not like Ukraine could just put up a couple fighter jets or bombers and fly into Russia and just bomb them. After all, Russia possesses one of the world's most sophisticated air defense networks with some of the world's best air defense systems, at least on paper. So instead, Ukraine decided to get creative, developing domestically produced systems that include kamikaze drones as well as a new cruise missile system that have allowed them to target deep inside of Russia, and so far it appears that this has worked. In 2023, there were several documented strikes targeting at least 3 oil refineries as well as at least 2 different oil storage sites. In 2024, however, things dramatically picked up. Ukraine increased the tempo with at least 13 strikes targeting at least 11 refineries, at least 1 natural gas processing plant, and at least 1 power plant. Already in 2025, Ukraine has launched at least 5 attacks targeting at least 3 oil refineries with at least 2 natural gas processing plants. I will say, however, I'm saying at least here, but this number of strikes tends to vary by source, and so it's kind of hard to get a read on just exactly how many strikes Ukraine has launched, but it's been several. For example, BBC Russia stated that over 80 Ukrainian strikes occurred in 2024 targeting Russian energy facilities. If you ask the Russian Ministry of Defense, however, then there were 0 strikes, and everything was just an unfortunate accident. The bottom line, however, here is that Ukraine is picking up its strike tempo, and it is increasing its targeting of Russian oil facilities all across the country. The tempo is increasing, but why didn't Ukraine launch these attacks earlier in the war? Well, it's a mix of capabilities and politics. Ukraine has developed their own domestic system. However, and we'll discuss this more in here in just a moment, a lot of these systems just didn't exist whenever the war kicked off, and they've had to really develop these systems as the war has gone on. They also didn't have support from Western countries like the United States to launch a lot of these types of attacks. For example, President Biden was reportedly concerned with the global economic impact that would happen if Ukraine were to target Russia's energy sector. So he had requested that Ukraine lay off the Jews. I believe that this was something that I talked about on this channel back whenever that happened or that story came out. I know that I talked about this on Twitter, but needless to say, that was a very deeply unserious request. Now, however, in 2025, you can see that Ukraine is back on the juice and they're striking all kinds of facilities all across Russia's energy sector. The platforms that Ukraine is using are pretty interesting to note as well. They're largely domestically produced one-way kamikaze drones. However, they have some pretty interesting systems as well. For instance, they have the Yutny AN-196, which was developed in October of 2022. Note that that's after the war had started. It can carry a warhead up to 50 to 75 kilograms in size, up to 1 to 2,000 kilometers. By and large, at least that I've seen, the AN-196 is the workhorse of a lot of these strikes. A lot of these strikes take place with the AN-196 as the predominant system that's being used. It's cheap, it's effective, it's long range, it's what they're using. Next, you have the UJ-22. This is a lighter weight drone with a long range. It is also propeller driven and incredibly slow. You also have the Beaver. This is smaller and lighter than the UJ-22. It also is the ordnance. It doesn't necessarily carry the ordnance. It's interesting too, though, because I see it's also twice the price of the Shahed drone. And though I've seen one source claim that it carries its own counter-electronic warfare protection. That's at least the claim. However, I've seen plenty of videos of these things crashing into stuff because of EW. So take that for what it is. You also have some pretty interesting systems like the Peklo, which is a Ukrainian domestically produced cruise missile. It's very fast. It can reach speeds as high as 700 kilometers per hour, and it has a range of about 700 kilometers. It appears to be something that can be basically attached to a plane, carried up to a high altitude, and then just dropped and launched from the sky. Next, you have ATACMS. This is a US-made system. We've talked about this before on the channel, at least, and it is quite fast. It is very long range, and it is a very powerful system. Up to this point, the US had restrictions on what Ukraine could and could not target with ATACMS. However, Ukraine doesn't have a lot of these systems, so they really have to be careful with what targets they decide to use with this. So you do have a pretty diverse assortment of interesting tools that Ukraine has at its disposal to target Russian energy facilities. It's got slower and cheaper long-range drones that can saturate near space and demand targeting from Russian air defense. And then while those are being intercepted and tracked, Ukraine can launch a second wave of much faster, much more effective systems like ATACMS or the Peklo to also target the key facilities that they really want to make sure that they hit. So Russia's ultimately being forced to choose between what kind of systems they want to defend against and which ones they don't. Do they want to choose to hold off on some of the, lighter and cheaper drones and instead target, and intercept ATACMS and the Peklo? Or are they willing to just let those things pass through and see what happens? Either way, with so many of these systems being launched at any given time and with such a specific scope per attack, it's basically guaranteed that at least some of these systems will reach their target. And so this, done multiple times over and over again, scaled up across a year, and Ukraine is able to reach all kinds of different energy facilities all across Russia, even despite Russia's air defense network. Now, what's interesting to us today specifically is Russia's energy infrastructure, which is particularly vulnerable in terms of Russia's economy. It is the main driver of Russia's economy right now. Due to sanctions, it's harder for Russia to procure the different resources needed to make more extensive and specific repairs. It can source a lot of these items from China, for example, and that has been done. However, it really opens up a lot of these Chinese firms to risk of secondary sanctions, and that has actually pulled some Chinese companies to pull back from supporting Russia. And so with some of these refineries not able to resume operations, they've actually had to pull back on their energy exports. And despite all of this, Russia was still somehow able to increase energy revenues last year. And so with that, I think it's very important to take things within context here. The threat that these strikes pose to Russia isn't really in the individual strikes themselves. Russia is absolutely massive, and its energy exporting capacity is absolutely massive. Losing one refinery isn't going to be a knockout punch for Russia. Even if several of these plants are down, Russia will still be able to sell oil and other kinds of energy products products for a profit. However, it's the ongoing month-to-month, year-to-year, multiple refineries to multiple refinery strike campaign that's really posing greater problems for Russia. Of course, Ukraine in this case is highly dependent on exactly how effective these attacks are. Attacks that lightly damaged refineries only kept them out of operation for just a few weeks. For example, whenever the Ust-Luga refinery and the Ryazan refinery were targeted back early in 2024, they were lightly damaged and able to resume operations within 3 weeks. However, if the drones are able to critically damage very critical components of the refinery and cause extensive damages, then it can be a lot harder to repair and cause longer outages. For example, in early 2024, refineries in Krasnodar and Rostov were heavily damaged, and in fact they were damaged to the point that the cost exceeded the amount of profits that they generated, and so they were ultimately expected to close at the end of the year. These two refineries, however, were smaller refineries, so it's not a rule that we can pick up and apply to, say, to the Ryazan refinery, which is one of Russia's largest. It would take dozens of strikes likely to hit the Ryazan factory, causing critical damage, again, dozens of times, to be able to basically force Russia to shut that thing down. Either way, that is to say that the strike campaign isn't so much a series of sucker punches that could each knock out the Russian economy, it's more death by a thousand paper cuts. The more plants that Russia has to partially close, the more time that they have to spend repairing, the more money that they have to spend repairing these facilities, and the less oil that Russia is able to export, then the lower profits that they can generate each year. Even though that didn't exactly happen in 2024, this is at least the logic that's being carried on to 2025 and beyond. They're like sanctions. They don't create overnight effects. Rather, it's the sustained broad application of the campaign or the sanctions that create impacts to the economy. In fact, this drone campaign marries very well with the sanctions regime because it forces Russia to take extra time and care to repair these facilities, to defend against the strikes themselves, and if the damage is more complex, then it can ultimately hurt the bottom line. A few weeks ago, we discussed how Russia's economy is really approaching a crisis. And again, I'm going to link you to that video at the end of this one. Well, Russia has ultimately been able to cover the costs of their military losses because of their energy sector. It's, again, like I already said, incredibly robust. China is Russia's largest customer in oil, followed closely by India. However, in terms of liquefied natural gas, Russia's largest customer is, in fact, the European Union. Following the EU is actually China, but China lags way behind the European Union in terms of imports. In fact, Russia is France's largest LNG provider. For all the talk that Germany and France have made about the threat that Russia poses to European security and how outraged they are that the invasion of Ukraine is happening, they certainly don't seem to mind paying for Russian liquefied natural gas. That may, however, be changing soon. Over the past few years, the United States actually has become Europe's largest LNG provider. And with President Trump entering office and his priority to, quote, drill baby drill, or really just, exploit the environment for more natural resources, that might actually increase the amount of LNG that the U.S. can provide and sell to Europe. This is also a major initiative that President Biden wanted to try to produce, which was swapping out Russian energy imports to Europe with U.S. imports. And I'm sure that this is probably a priority that President Trump's going to want to maintain as well. When it comes to Ukraine, this is all, of course, quite meaningful. It means that European countries can actually afford to sanction Russia's energy sector even more heavily without the risk of losing power. It also opens the door for further Ukrainian strikes across Russia's energy sector, because now they wouldn't necessarily be directly hurting their European allies that are providing them support. Instead, they can target LNG facilities and really start to deal some damage to Russia's bottom line. And while Russia can cover the cost today, there's no telling what tomorrow will bring or whether they'll be able to continue to cover the cost. And if Europe's not paying them for LNG and Russia's already having to sell oil to China at a bit of a steep discount, then there's no telling whether they'll be able to maintain their current revenue stream or if they'll begin to start taking heavy cuts. And at some point, these strikes are going to start to catch up to Russia. And whenever that happens, the decreasing economic revenue paired with the growing cost of the war is going to create some political dynamics that are rather stressful for President Vladimir Putin. But perhaps that's all a topic for another day. So with all that, I want to hear your thoughts on all of this down below. Let me know if you think that this strike campaign is rather successful for Ukraine or not, and if you think that this is an effective strategy. Like this video if you found it helpful or informative. It also helps this channel reach new audiences, and it really grows the kind of conversations that we can have down in the comments. And subscribe for more conversations just like this I post every week. With all that, I'll see y'all later.